To spam units or not to spam them? That is the question. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about forming monolithic armies and phalanxes of multiple copies of the same unit, against being a bit more freeform and taking a wide variety of unit options throughout the whole of your codex. Is it better just to field multiple copies of the best datasheet over and over again, or are there some disadvantages to being a bit less flexible and losing a fair few battlefield options and tactical flexibility? In the video we'll talk about some of the positives of spamming lots of units that are the same, and some of the negatives, and look briefly at a couple of army lists that kind of exemplify this. First up though, I thought it would be worth mentioning the rule of 3, which isn't a particularly widely shown off army rule that comes in the mustering your forces section of the match play missions. Basically between this and the slots that you have available in the force organization chart, they both work together to put some limits on how many times you can spam the same datasheet over and over. For example, you can only have each datasheet used 3 times in a 2000 point match play game, excluding units like troops and transports, so you can go crazy and have as many of those as you like. I think of the things that Games Workshop upgraded 8th edition with, I must admit I really quite like the rule of 3. In early 8th edition I remember lots of people were spamming a whole ton of things like Dark Angel's Dark Talons, or Winged Hive Tyrants with a ton of Devourers, both of which were really quite strong at the time, and you could quite reasonably make an entire list of almost nothing but those models and have quite a good chance of winning. I quite like the way that the rule of 3 does put spam of any one datasheet within kind of reasonable levels. Maybe I wouldn't be too surprised to see a wing of 3 Dark Talons within a Dark Angel's army, but having 8 of them seems a bit excessive to me. It's not a thing for more casual games though, which is probably for the best for recreating some interesting and more narrative lists, but I do quite like the way that it helps stop the more competitive side of 40k from turning into spam of one single unit. So why does taking multiple copies of the same good unit tend to lead to such good results? First of all, you can try and overwhelm your opponent with the same defensive profile, which has long been a thing in Warhammer 40k. Often building up a decent amount of armor saturation can be a good idea, because most balanced army lists will only be able to deal with so much of any one given target per turn of shooting or melee. For example, if your opponent has a whole bunch of anti-tank weapons, they'll be able to kill around about 2 of your tanks per turn. If you only brought 3 tanks along as part of a balanced list, then you'd have just lost more than half of your tank force, but if you brought 6 of them along, you've only lost 2 tanks, and the other 4 will be able to fire back at them next turn at full effect. I think 9th edition makes this a little bit less important than it used to be, as on 9th boards you can often hide units really quite well, but it still certainly applies to some degree. Otherwise, spamming units also removes enemy choices. If you're just presenting them with multiple copies of the same unit across your whole army, then they won't just be able to pick apart the single most vulnerable part of your list, they'll have a choice between shooting one dreadnought, for example, or another identical dreadnought. They can't just take out your single most important unit that's going to damage their army the best. If you are taking lots of units that are the same battlefield role, it might be a bit easier to execute some sort of grand strategy if you're going for it, such as say if you're playing Drakari and you're running lots and lots of squads and raiders. Turn 1 you could hide behind terrain and then move up into the midfield. Then turn 2 you can have some absolute mass charges on the go, with everything jumping out of the raiders and engaging half the enemy army in one turn. It's a bit easier to form a battle plan like that if you don't have a whole bunch of random units running around and doing their own thing. Perhaps one of the single biggest drivers though to spamming units is that often within codexes things aren't ideally balanced, and often one unit will be better at doing its battlefield role than the other choices available. In the codexes where Games Workshop hasn't enormously done internal balance well, it is quite likely that one choice of datasheet is going to get maxed out before moving on to the next one. For example, a lot of Space Marine players might really look at the Redemptor Dreadnought as the go-to for in-Dreadnought codex options, and you might see multiple of them fielded before you ever move on to the other choices that might not be quite as efficient. That will often be while a lot of damage dealer units are fielded up to the maximum of 3 that you can take, as they're just the best choice for the role within the codex. Finally, I think that armies that do have really quite a small codex, without all that many different options, are certainly going to have quite a lot more motivation to spam the same unit compared with an army like, say, Space Marines, where they've got a whole ton of different choices for every single battlefield role imaginable. Sure, a lot of those choices are better than others, but armies with a lot of viable choices will generally be able to field diverse, interesting units, a lot more interesting than, say, Harlequins, who only have a very limited number of datasheets within the codex. In general, I'd say the best units to spam usually tend to be multi-purpose efficient units that can damage all targets. Things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts with Onslaught Gatling Cannons and Plasma Incinerators, good at shooting, good in melee and fairly tough, or Drakari Raiders full of assault units. They put out some decent anti-tank, and the things that are getting out of them can usually blend virtually anything. Typically the units that might not get spammed as much in more competitive lists are the ones that are a little bit more niche. Say for example Space Marine Eradicators, they're really efficient anti-tank units, but you can only afford to dedicate so many points to anti-tank within the list, so it's pretty rare to see competitive lists taking 3 maxed out squads of Eradicators for example, as 1 or 2 squads can really fill their role quite well. Just for one example of a competitive tournament list that does spam very well indeed is Manichima's Orc Boggies list that placed first at the WG Open Summer Slaughter. The vast majority of this list are 3 units of 3 Megatrak Scrapjets and 3 units of 3 Ruckstruck Squig Boggies, both of which you can dedicate an excessive amount of points to, as each datasheet allows you to take 3 of the boggies and they're like 90 points each. They're quite a scary proposition to take out on the table, they're all presenting the exact same defensive profile, lots of light vehicles with the Ramshackle special rule which has -1 damage for low strength weapons. Most lists just aren't going to be able to shoot a significant amount of these to death each turn, so they should be able to go off and do their thing for most of the game. Other things that really make the spam viable is that they do enough damage to basically any target that you throw them at that they just really can't be ignored. They're really quite fast, so you're not going to be able to outrange them. The Squig Boggies themselves are all artillery, so with their threat range they'll be able to make their presence felt on just about any unit on the board. And to cap it all off, they're not even particularly weak in close combat, or having saw blades or nose drills. It's pretty much the epitome of take a couple of units that can deal with virtually anything, take absolutely tons of them, and the opponent is going to have a bad time. So on the flip side then, what are the reasons to field a fair bit of unit diversity in 9th, rather than just spamming the maximum of the single strongest thing? In general, I'd say perhaps the biggest reason not to overcommit to just one type of units is that while spamming one thing will tend to overwhelm the enemy in one capacity, you might sort of get into diminishing returns for filling that one battlefield role. In general, for most balanced units in 9th, they'll typically be best at doing 1 or 2 things within your army, and if you take too many of them, then likely you might have got just as good returns by taking a few less, and then investing the points in something else. Going back to Eradicators, if you're spamming loads of efficient anti-tank units, they won't be doing you a fat lot of good against hordes. Or say if your faction has a few truly excellent screening chaff units, the first 1 or 2 that you get maybe could be really handy, block out the most important areas for deep strike or getting to objectives, and then after that the others might be a little bit redundant, as the best places to screen already have a unit in them. It works for just about every battlefield role in the game. There's no point in having absolutely tons of efficient objective holders if you've already got enough to hold your own objectives, and it's helpful to have the right balance of battle line damage dealing units with fast moving utility units so you can both win the objectives and destroy the opponent's army. On the flip side of that, having a whole host of different threats and things to think about is usually going to make the opponent's decision making that bit trickier. For example, if you commit too much to ranged units, they could hide out of line of sight. If you commit too much to melee units, they could attempt to kite your army for a turn or 2, then countercharge. But if you've got a nice mix, then neither strategy is going to work amazingly. Having other specialist threats and screening units is pretty handy as well. Say having a couple of deep strike reserved threats could be really good to make your opponent have to screen them out. And having a few forward deploy options could also threaten damage or secure objectives right from turn 1 as well. I did mention this previously, but in 9th with its good line of sight blocking terrain, in general I'd argue that having every single unit being the same defensive profile perhaps isn't quite as important. You're often able to hide the ones that you really need to each turn, and it means that not all of your army has to be the same very tough defensive profile to ensure that you get your damage through. As well as that, a list being a little bit monodimensional might mean that it might be a bit easier to counter in a few ways. You might just happen to run into someone else's list that's got absolutely tons of weapons that are great at dealing with your spammed unit. Say if you've taken nothing but light infantry, and then you run into a list that's got absolutely amazing anti-horde. You might open yourself up to an element of your army being countered by a basic gameplay move. Say for example in 8th edition where people used to take quite a lot of Leviathans with 24-inch ranged guns. That might open them up to just having the enemy army deployed just outside of their range so they can't shoot them turn 1 for guarantees. Finally, taking a whole bunch of units of the exact same type might mean that you're a bit easier to take down with secondary objectives. If you're packing as many tanks as possible into a list, then it might be fairly easy for the opponent to max bring it down. Often people try to build fairly varied lists just to avoid any single kill secondary being an easy thing for your opponent to achieve. Finally, just as another couple of thoughts, just from a bit more of a real world perspective, I feel like spamming 3 of the best unit can often just be a little bit less economical, as of course it means that you have to buy 3 different kits as opposed to just 1 or 2. As the strongest thing in 40k does tend to come around in cycles, with what being the best thing at the moment might not be the best thing in 6 months' time due to chapter approved points changes or various FAQs, I rarely tend to go out and buy 3 different copies of a unit to spam it maximally for the rule of 3. I'll generally build them up one at a time unless the unit is quite small. Just as one example, when they came out in 8th edition, running a trio of Invictus tactical warsuits was one of the strongest things that you could play as Space Marines. Starting them all up the board for an absolutely massive alpha strike. In 9th they tend to be a bit more of a niche choice, perhaps one or two in certain armies such as Ultramarines, and it does mean that if you always want to spam 3 of the best thing, it might be a little bit more punishing on the wallet if you are chasing the meta. I personally often tend to build up quite slowly, perhaps just build up and paint one of the best units at the moment, and then if I really want to add another one, then I might do later down the line. Another non-tactical consideration is that having a fair bit of unit diversity is quite good fun in a list. Although it can be quite good fun to play with and against a very spammy army once or twice, it might get a little bit old after a while, and quite a lot of interesting gaming experiences in 40k often tend to be how multiple interesting units interact in unexpected ways. I think given the choice, at least most people would prefer to see an army that's fairly well balanced on the other side of the table, as opposed to one that's literally all one thing. Certainly not saying that massed infantry or tank formations aren't cool or anything, but perhaps something to consider before going out and buying 10 copies of the same thing. Finally, just to round up with a couple of rough examples, here's a Custodians list that took first place at the Tower Tipping Grand Tournament by Stephen Trimble. I have mentioned it on the channel before. As Custodians, a lot of the units are really quite big and meaty, meaning spam maybe isn't quite as necessary, but still really quite cool to see that almost every unit is different, aside from one repeated Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought. There's troops to hold the backfield, some hardy troops to slog up into the middle, a couple of units of fast movers, and a few threatening dreadnoughts to hold the battle line. For another example of a very competitive army that doesn't have too much spam, here's the Sisters of Battle list by John Lennon that took second at the Orlando Open Games Workshop tournament. It basically uses 2 copies of the vast majority of the Sororitas infantry units: Battle Sisters, Repentia, Zephyrim, Dominions, Seraphim, and Retributors, though it's quite interesting that none of them are ever taken to the maximum amount that he could have done, meaning that the list has a massive amount of diverse threats and utility units, 2 very scary characters protected by some sacrosancts, and deep strikers and some heavy hitters pouring out of rhinos. So overall, I think in reality, there's decent advantages both to spamming units and taking a wide variety of units within an army. I think most of the strongest lists will often tend to max out at least one unit type within their army, but then back that up with different units to fill different battlefield roles. For example, spamming the unit that's going to deal the most damage, and then having utility units to camp objectives, move fast, and outflank, deep strike, or infiltrate before the army. I'll certainly be interested to hear what your thoughts are on spamming units versus taking a whole bunch of varied stuff. Let me know down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, and if you'd like to help support the channel, I would just like to mention that there's an Auspex Tactics Patreon page down in the video description below, which is what allows me to make so many videos quite so often. If you are enjoying a lot, then any support is massively appreciated. Feel free to check it out down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.